This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The topic is B films. I have two experts that I will be speaking with. Beverly Gray has written a book about Roger Corman, the American B film maestro, and Blair Davis has written a book on the history of B films, and we'll be talking with both of them in a moment. The subject is B films, and as someone who was born in the mid-60s, I grew up watching B films on television as a kid, from the early stuff like the serials of the 1930s that I watched with my dad, to the early serial westerns, B westerns, B sci-fi films of the 30s and 40s through the heyday of the 50s, and then through Roger Corman and American International Pictures from the 50s and onward through the Hammer horror films, the slasher films of the 70s and 80s, and on through the modern B films that were straight to video. So I want to welcome both Blair and Beverly. Blair, let me start with you and just ask if you could take a few minutes, give a little bit of background about your interest in B films in general and the book that you wrote.
Sure, yeah. I'm currently an assistant professor at DePaul University in Chicago, but I started researching B films, writing my dissertation when I did my PhD at McGill, and was sort of encouraged by my advisor. He said, no one's really taken this stuff seriously. No one's done extensive scholarly research on this. There's been a couple of books. There was King of the Bees, written a long time ago. He says this is ripe for someone to take seriously and study in a historical industrial context. I thought, yeah, it kind of does. People just look at this as schlocky, trashy stuff, but let's look at the impact that it had on the film industry. So I wrote my dissertation about that, turned it into a book called The Battle for the Bees, 1950s Hollywood and the Rebirth of Low-Budget Cinema. And now I'm fortunate enough I get to teach B films, and I have a course I've created simply called B movies, and tracing the origins through into its legacy in the modern era. Currently, I'm just wrapping up a book called Movie Comics, in which I'm further looking at B films as how they've adapted comic books in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So continuing my look at low budget cinema in that regard in my current research. So that's me.
That's like the Batman, the Superman, the Fleischer cartoons.
Yep, and all the comic strip adaptations of Dick Tracy, all the Republic stuff as well.
Oh, okay.
That kind of stuff for sure.
Well, Beverly Gray is an author. She's written some biographies of people. One of them is Roger Corman, and Roger Corman, as I had mentioned, is probably the king of B films. And when we think of B films from the 50s, 60s, and onward, he probably comes first to mind. So, Beverly, if you could just take a moment, talk about yourself, how you got interested in B films, and why you decided to write a book on Roger Corman.
Well, my background is pretty unusual. I was finishing up a PhD in contemporary American literature at UCLA when the phone rang and Roger Corman wanted to interview me for a job. I didn't know who he was at the time. He had just started New World Pictures, and this being Roger, he was going to a very academic place to find someone to help make what he would not call, but I would call, B movies. So I worked for Roger both at New World Pictures and later at Concord New Horizons Pictures. So I've been in the trenches making these genre films for a good many years. So it was very natural after I left Corman's to think that the man was at least as interesting in and of himself as the movies he'd made. So that was the reason for a book that for me was very personal.
Well, was this an authorized bio then? Did he cooperate, and did you interview him?
That is a story in and of itself. When I got the contract to write this book, I went to Roger and I said that I was going to be writing it. And he said, and you'll have to forgive me because everybody who's ever worked for Roger does the Roger Corman imitation. It just comes out. So he said, Beverly, I would be happy to cooperate with you in any possible way as long as you can reassure me that this book will be largely favorable. And that took me aback a bit. And I said I had learned so much from him. I was very excited about writing about his life. And then he phoned me and said that he'd been giving the whole thing some thought and that he wanted me and my publisher to sign a legal document saying that he could read my book in manuscript and was authorized to remove anything that he considered quote, derogatory. That was not a good basis on which to write a serious independent biography.
Yeah.
So he said, think it over. And I came back to him a few weeks later with a letter I was proud of, and that said, Roger, I've learned many things from you over the many years, nearly a decade, that we've worked together. And one of the most valuable lessons you taught me was the importance of artistic independence. So, no, it is not an authorized biography. It is very much an independent biography, calling upon my vast web of resources within the Corman world. And I'm proud that it's considered by people who ought to know as the true story of Roger, because it's the one book that written about him that he's had absolutely nothing to do with.
Okay, well, let's go back in history a bit to the start of B films, and I'll probably focus a little bit on Blair for a few minutes here, but Beverly, feel free to join in if you have any anecdotes about Corman or any of his influences in this period. As far as I know, Blair, the silent film era didn't have B films. Did B films start once the sound era hit?
Primarily, yeah. I mean, there are precursors. I haven't dug that deep into them because there really isn't a lot of literature existing about them. That's another project, I think, altogether. I mean, you can distinguish between this term that we call B film and then the overall category of low-budget filmmaking in general. There's been low-budget filmmaking, for decades prior to the 1930s, but this idea of what a B film is does come about in the early 1930s. It corresponds with the rise of the double bill. In about 1930, 1931, they're starting to feel the effects of the Great Depression. Audiences are declining, and they're trying to figure out how are we going to get people to come to the theaters. And some independent movie theaters began to offer 2 films for the price of 1. And it caught on, and then other independent theaters started, and it made its way up to the integrated theater chains that started to feel the pressure. By 1935, RKO and the like are all offering 2 films for the price of 1, but they don't want to make 2 high-budget pictures. It's not cost-effective. So this idea of giving them 1 higher-cost, prestige, major stars, higher budget, along with as low a budget as they can, is where this distinction came in between the A film and the B film. It was an industry term to designate a sort of a lower budget type of film that would play on the bottom of a double bill. There was also a system called block booking, in which they would sell their films in large blocks to theaters. If you wanted to get the A films, you had to take a package of B films as well. So there's where this distinction comes in the industry between films of different budgetary categories. So there were
excuse me, this was also the era when the studios owned theater chains, correct? So that's where block booking came in.
Yes, absolutely. Now, it wasn't all of the movie theaters were owned by major film studios. Now, Universal and Columbia didn't own their own theater chains. It was RKO, MGM, and the bigger chains. They owned, however, the prestige theaters, the biggest ones, the big movie palaces in the downtown theaters. There were more independent chains, but if they wanted to get Hollywood product, then they had to conform to this block booking standard. So it was the independents that said, yes, we want your product, we will take your B pictures in this block booking format. Yeah.
Now, the 1930s, as far as I know, I guess the B films that dominated were the Westerns. John Wayne spent a decade before Stagecoach as a B film star from like 29 to 39. He probably did 100 plus hour-long B film westerns. Were the westerns and then the serials like the Buster Crabbe kind of serials and were they the sci-fi serials? Were they basically the meat of the early B era?
I wouldn't say. No, I would. It depends on what type of area you're looking at. There were really different patterns of what audiences preferred, depending upon if you're talking about a downtown type of audience versus neighborhoods and suburbs versus the real small towns and the rural areas. The outskirts, the rural areas and small towns loved the westerns. They played really, really well. They didn't go in for musicals, for example, in the smaller towns. Musicals sort of seemed like a bigger city thing. There's these strange patterns of how genres had different preferences, and so the westerns didn't play so great operate in the major downtown theaters. It was more, crime films, for example, dramas, things of that nature. Westerns, you could find westerns, but they were much, much bigger in the outskirts, I would say. Serials are sort of all over the place, more so in neighborhood theaters, more so reserved for Saturday screenings for children. There were some series like Flash Gordon that were big hits across the board with adults, but sort of more than not, serials were sort of reserved for special screenings on Saturdays. There are variations to that story, of course, but there are really interesting patterns of what played where in terms of the different types of audiences, sort of the more prestigious downtown audiences versus those that were poorer perhaps in the rural areas.
Now, Beverly, let me ask you, since Roger Corman grew up, was born in 1926, he would have grown up as a young boy during the Depression. Was he a film fanatic then, and was he taken by a lot of these serials and early westerns? Was he always, or was he attracted to the bigger films? What was his basis in film that as a boy?
He always liked movies, but what he really talked more about in his boyhood was some of his other interests. Making model planes was one of them, and doing a great deal of reading. In high school, very formative thing he was given as I believe, a Christmas present in any case, a book of Poe's short stories, and that was going to, of course, be an important inspiration for him. He also really liked adventure stories, and he liked these of the movies too, but his boyhood movie going is not something he talks about all that much, but he certainly has a passion for all kinds of movies, everything from Hitchcock to Eisenstein's Potemkin to a great variety of films. He doesn't specifically talk about the films that Blair has just so interestingly talked about.
Was he someone who was reading a lot of sci-fi books? Like you had the golden age of science fiction in pulp magazines. Was he reading that kind of thing? The Asimovs, the Bradburys, the Heinleins, these people who came along in the 30s and 40s?
Again, it's a very interesting question, and no one has asked me that before. Surely he knows these things, but it's not something I've heard him talk about as much as he's talked about Joseph Conrad novels, for example, or some old classics that he was fond of. I remember he's always talked about wanting to make a film of Conrad's The Outcast of the Islands, and I believe Carol Reed made one of those a long time ago. So it's not entirely those kinds of monster movies that I've heard him reminisce about.
Well, Blair, let me turn back to you. By the time the 1940s came around, there was some, what we could call now maybe some auteurs within B films. And I'm thinking of the Val Lewton horror films, Cat People and whatnot. These were low budget, certainly, but they had their own style. This is also when film noir rose, and although there was certainly a film noirs, when we think of film noirs, we think of sort of B films. Was the 1940s sort of really the first flowering of B film as an art form, do you think?
I would probably agree with that. I mean, within the studio system, you're talking about people that are being supervised typically by producers that want this made, as quickly and cheaply as possible. We're talking about B films, but the films that we point to as being the most memorable B films, and certainly the ones that my students don't shrug their shoulders at as much, tend to be things made, by Val Lewton, particularly Jacques Tourneur's Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie. The shadowy cinematography in those films is absolutely remarkable. I think holds up with any A picture of the period. And then things even from Producers Releasing Corporation, directed by Edgar G. Ulmer. Things like Detour. My students absolutely go nuts over Detour. They can't believe that it was made on that low of a budget, and even some of Ulmer's other films like Bluebeard, which is sort of a horror film, sort of not, are really stylish. And I think you point to that period in which you get some voices that you can use the auteur theory to trace narrative patterns and stylistic patterns, certainly. I don't see as much of that, I think you're right, within the 1930s, even though there are some terrific B films. You don't point to the creators behind them and perhaps as the reasons why they are so successful. It's, they're adapting comic books, or they're, making a rousing adventure film that holds up on its own right. So I would probably agree with that argument. There's been an increasing amount of scholarship around people like Tourneur and Edgar G. Ulmer, for example, in recent years.
Yeah, and I know probably one of the few films that I think is actually better than the original is Curse of the Cat People, which was Robert Wise co-directed. It was his first thing. And to me, I've always said the two greatest films told from a child's point of view are two films that have generally been overlooked. One is Curse of the Cat People, which is told from a young girl's point of view. And although the original Cat People seemingly had supernatural elements, this film could be seen solely as the child's looking back on the loss of her, I believe, mother. And then the other one is the Godzilla film that's always slagged on, Godzilla's Revenge, which I think is a really daring film about latchkey children, which was made almost 30 years later. But there also, and with film noir, I did a show about film noir last year, you get, I think, a lot of these deeper themes. You had a lot of sometimes people who were bigger stars a decade earlier coming back in doing things like Nightmare Alley. To me, is one of the great films noir. But let me turn to Beverly there. So Roger Corman during this era was he serving in World War II, and or was he doing sort of like Frank Capra? Was he doing films, or was he an infantry soldier, or what was he doing during that era?
Well, Roger was in the military. He was a student at Stanford when, at the time, people were starting to get drafted left and right. And he joined a program in the Navy, which was going to train him and make him into an officer. So he was lucky enough to never actually serve in World War II. He went through this program, which took him out of Stanford and into college somewhere in the Midwest. But he never actually saw military service.
Oh, no. And what was he doing anything trying to get into the film industry during that era?
It's very interesting because Roger, he had been involved in high school in what they called radio drama. So that, I suspect, was the era where he really polished his speaking style, because anyone who's heard Roger Corman speak has heard a man whose voice is very low and very deliberate and very careful. So my own suspicion, and his brother sounds nothing like that, my own suspicion is that's what brought a shy kid forward in a way and made him interested in drama and movies. He was also interested in movies because in the height of the Depression, his father retired and moved his family from Michigan to Beverly Hills, California, where at Beverly Hills High School, he was surrounded by the children of movie folk. So I think that was very formative. But he went to Stanford to study engineering. His father had been an engineer. And that is what his degree is in. There was no film program in Stanford at the time. There was absolutely nothing. But he came out of school determined somehow to get into the movie business because he said he thought it was not only art, but an exciting way to make money. And for me, that's a quote that he gave in the 70s to an interviewer. And I've always loved it because for me, he was interested in Roger Corman's psychological makeup. Those are three things that have always been important to him. Art, or at least craft, because Roger wouldn't out and out call himself an artist, but I think he's proud, and rightly so, of his craftsmanship as a filmmaker. He wanted, certainly as a young man, excitement, and he wanted to make money. So film is where he went, and he managed, starting in the late 1950s, to do that.
Well, let's before we hit the 50s and when Corman gets in, let's just let me wrap up with Blair in the 1940s. And I wanted to talk about sort of a couple of things. Number one, if you could explain, there's a term in B film called Poverty Row, especially during the 1940s, what that was, and were there B films coming from overseas, or had foreign films not yet hit during the 1940s? Because I think of actors from Germany and Europe that came over in the 1930s. Peter Lorre had some A films and also some B films. Albert Decker did Dr. Cyclops, which is a great B film. So were there foreign films that were considered B films in that era, or were they all from Hollywood and from Poverty Row?
Well, I'll start with the question of foreign films. There's not a lot that I've seen. There may well be some. The practice didn't really start until the 1950s because, we might get to this, there was a real drop in the number of films being produced in the 1950s, and there were still theaters that were still showing double bills in the 50s that needed product, anything to pad out the fact that they needed to change their films 2 or 3 times a week. And so some distributors began to look overseas in the 50s for what else can we find and bring over. Some of them were huge hits, like Godzilla and the Hercules films, and AIP and Roger Corman began to bring over some titles as well and redub them. But in the 40s, you didn't really need to turn overseas. There may be some, I haven't looked into it that closely, but Hollywood was producing enough product to meet the demands of the various levels of distribution that were required. More films needed for the outskirts and the rural areas because they turned over their product so quickly. And so the rural areas as well relied heavily on the products of what you call Poverty Row. Poverty Row is not an official term. It's sort of a slang term that the industry came up with as early as the 1930s to distinguish between major Hollywood studios and, for lack of a better word, the wannabes, the companies that were sort of more the fly-by-night outfits that produced almost exclusively very, very cheap films made for a fraction of the cost. If the average Hollywood film in the 1930s, by like 1935 or so, would cost between $350,000 to upwards of even $1 million, Poverty Row could make a film for as cheap as about $8,000, a mere fraction of a high A film budget. And so there was talk and variety in the magazines about how atrocious these lower Poverty Row films were, and they came up with terms like Poverty Row to make the distinction that these are impoverished productions, and they were made very cheaply. I make an anecdote about one company that moved in to a building, and they kept getting knocks on the door because it used to be owned by a bookie, and people kept coming to place bets while they were trying to write their scripts, because this was the type of area that they worked in, was this kind of lower end of town, the other side of Hollywood, where the rents were cheaper. And all these studios rented spaces in the same area, in this Gower Gulch, the region of Hollywood. So they termed it Poverty Row, a street where all of these companies worked out of. So Republic was one of the better Poverty Row studios, the longer lasting, and had higher budgets, but there were smaller studios like Mascot, Producers Releasing Corporation, and a lot of them didn't last very long. Some of them you've never even heard of would last for a year or two, and then they were gone. There were dozens of them. There was a high turnover rate. Republic, Monogram, Producers Releasing Corporation are the three best ones, but even their films, the budgets aren't nearly as high as what Hollywood would produce. So different economic distinctions, again, where this term poverty comes in to describe Poverty Row.
Now, I mentioned that. Oh, I'm sorry. I mentioned that John Wayne had sort of graduated from the B films of the 30s, and Stagecoach was his ticket to stardom. Could you name maybe a couple of other people who became big A stars in the 40s or late 40s and 50s that started out in the Bs?
Rita Hayworth got her start making a number of B films, so you keep your eyes open on Turner Classic Movies. You'll see her in supporting roles in all sorts of things, Mexican Spitfire movies, Abbott and Costello movies, before she became a leading lady. Also, Glenn Ford, I want to say, possibly Alan Ladd. Like, you look at, it was sort of for not just actors, but also for cinematographers and directors, kind of a training ground in which they would start you out on contract as working in the Bs and see how you did. And then if you, you had a great screen presence, they would elevate you to the As, or if your talent was proven in terms of your artistry or your craftsmanship, they would elevate you then and give you a chance of making an A film. Yeah.
Now, in the 1950s, and I'll get to Roger Corman's emergence in the middle of that decade, but growing up in the 1970s, you got fed a steady diet of the late 40s post-war sci-fi B films, and science fiction seemed to just sort of dominate after the war, because in terms of B films, that you had, you had A films like the Michael Rennie film where the UFO comes down.
Still?
Yeah, The Day the Earth Stood Still. But most of the films were silly little contrivances. Some were pretty good. Some were absolute schlock, like the robot monster stuff. Ed Wood came along.
We'll talk robot monster.
Yeah, Ed Wood came along with his films, and you had a little bit later people like Coleman Francis. But a lot of these films were of the variety that is so bad that they're so good. There was one, I think it came from hell, about this walking tree stump that just fell on its victims. So was that an era where, because like I said, in the 40s you had the Val Lewtons, you had the Tourneurs, you had some film noir really showing, if not high production values, real artistic flashes there. Then comes the 1950s Bs, and it's sort of like, gorilla costumes and all kinds of silliness. Was there a turn? Was this a budgetary matter that sort of turned?
This is what I chronicle in my book, The Battle for the Bs, in that 1950s B movies are a real turn in the industry from the era of this vertical integration, which they did away with in 1948. The Supreme Court ruled on it, called it illegal for movie studios to own their own theaters. B films in the 30s and 40s were sold as what is known as a flat rate. You could sell it for, make about $80,000 or $90,000 in sales. You knew how much you were going to bring in because theaters paid a flat rate. So if you make it for 60 and you're getting 80, you've made a decent profit. Other films were sold on a percentage basis, and you would split the share 80-20 or whatever it is with the movie theater. Then that's how the block booking system was able to be so effective. But 1948 comes around, Supreme Court says, your way of doing business, you have to break it up. It's a monopoly. And so this system of B movies goes by the wayside by the early 1950s. Independent producers see an opening in the industry to make films that Hollywood was starting to not make anymore. They turned to making huge, big budget blockbusters, the CinemaScope epics and all of that. They made fewer films. So the independents, and this is how AIP got their start, saw an opening as a need for product, which eventually they could find they could sell on a percentage basis. And so you had all of these companies that would be able to make these films on a much sort of cheaper rate, but get them into a wider number of theaters. And so you got the ability to get your film distributed in places that you couldn't in other decades prior, because of this major shift that happened in the film industry and in the exhibition industry, starting by about the effects were felt in the early 1950s. So sort of the floodgates open up, and there's a need for product, any product in many cases. And so you could make, It Came From Hell, Walking Tree, your Robot Monster made over $1 million. And so I like Robot Monster a little bit.
I want to add something to that, if I may.
Sure.
In the 50s, which is an era that interests me a great deal, one of the things that people like the AIP people were aware of was this was the era of the rise of the teenager. And in the post-war era, young people had a lot more discretionary income. They wanted to get out of their parents' house and go somewhere and do something. So it was really the era where the drive-ins were king, where the movies were movies that would appeal to young people. They had young cast members, they had young stories. It wasn't the dignity of the classic Hollywood stars. These were rough and ready movies, and someone who was a colleague of mine in the early days, Joe Dante, who of course went on to become a significant Hollywood filmmaker with films like Gremlins, he said, these were the movies that your parents didn't want you to see. And that was, of course, part of the attraction.
Well, let's talk about Corman's first few films in the mid-50s. How did he get started? Where did he get the funds from? Was he hanging out with a group of people in Hollywood that decided to just make films? And did AIP come a few years after his first films, Beverly?
AIP was starting around the same time Roger was starting. He really wanted to do something other than the engineering job that he originally started out with. And he was scrounging for movie jobs. He had a job as a studio reader and messenger at Fox, I believe. And he also worked at a literary agency. He was just trying to find his way in. His first movies, he had read something in the newspaper about an underwater kind of robotic satellite thing that struck him as really interesting, and he decided this would be the source of a good science fiction type movie. And he went to his parents. They said, we've already given you an education, forget it. He went to parents of friends, and he eventually rounded up a small sum of money with which to produce that first film, whose name escapes me at the moment.
Monster from the Ocean Floor?
No, it was much before the Monster.
Oh, it was okay. Yeah.
Right. In the first movie, Roger was a very practical guy, and so he was producing before he was directing. But one of the things that encouraged him to direct was the fact that by directing a movie, he was saving on a salary. So that became Five Guns West, which was the first movie that he directed. And he would go for any genre out there as long as it was something that could be made quickly and cheaply. And some of those early films have a lot of charm and a lot of vigor. And he was making them.
So was Roger more or less, do you think, someone who was a reluctant director? He preferred to be produced? Because when I'm looking here at some of the 50s titles, and we always think of Corman mostly with these sort of sci-fi monster movies. But as you said, Five Guns West, The Fast and the Furious, Gunslinger. Then we have some clearly teen titles like Rock All Night, Teenage Girl, or Teenage Doll, Sorority Girl. So he was just sort of, it looks like just shooting for any market he could get.
Exactly. Again, he was very shrewd and has continued to be. And one of the stories that I love about Roger was how good he was. He was in an era before recycling became a big term. He was the master recycler, which meant that if he had a good script concept, it was going to get made and then made and then made. He had made something in Hawaii called Naked Paradise, which was a great excuse for him and a bunch of people to go camp out in Hawaii and make a movie. And then he told Chuck Griffith that they were going to be going to the Black Hills of South Dakota, and they were going to make the same movie again in a different location, but added monster to it, and that became Beast from Haunted Cave, which, by the way, he made back-to-back in the same period of about 2 weeks with something called Ski Troop Attack, which was a World War II skiing movie made by people who really didn't ski, with Roger stepping in to play the Nazi villain because somebody had to do it, and the previous candidate had broken his leg. So here he was camping out in these miserable hotel rooms in winter in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and everybody paying something like 50 cents a day for these miserable accommodations. And Monty Hellman reminisced to me about this. He directed one of these as a young director and said that Roger was so cheap or parsimonious, or whatever you would like to say in polite terms, that what they had was cold ham sandwiches for lunch. And Monty said, if only we'd had a cup of soup, it would have made all the difference. But they would make whatever they could make, whatever they could slap together, whatever they could remake, they made it.
Well, let me turn to Blair for a moment. I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of the people that I most associate, the actors, with 1950s B films. And I think of people like Faith Demergue. She comes to mind. And Gene Barry. And also, I know before Gilligan's Island, Russell Johnson was in a slew of these B sci-fi films. Were these people? Because I know Gene Barry had a television show, Burke's Law, that I think came on maybe in the early 60s or maybe it was the late 50s. Were the B actors then, were they generally part of troops? And I can turn, Beverly can answer this after you, Blair, but did Corman and did a lot of these B studios have regular stocks of actors that appeared in films over and over again? I'll start with Blair.
It wasn't not in the same sort of organized sense that you would see in the majors, whereby they would be under a lock and key contract. I do see, a lot of sort of recurrence in AIP and in some of the other studios that even the last days of Republic in the 1950s, and you get the same type of stock roles that need to be filled, and these actors will fulfill it. What I also find really interesting, though, is how AIP would take a chance on new talent. And a lot of the films of this period, even movies like The Blob, an independent production, one of Steve McQueen's first films, with a lot of actors that would go on to major acclaim, Charles Bronson and people like that. There was a lot of looking for new talent, not just a reliance upon any kind of a stock actor, but like who else is out there that might be looking for a shot. So I see that pattern at work as well in companies like AIP.
How about Corman, Beverly? Did he have a...
Well, Mr. Corman's stock company became kind of famous, and one thing about Roger, again, is that everyone did everything. So if you were Robert Towne and you were a writer, you might end up as a leading actor in something as well. And of course, some of the names of the people who were involved became very well known, Jack Nicholson being the prime example of that. But Jack Nicholson originally gravitated toward Roger because he wanted to be a writer, although he and Roger did meet in an acting class. Dick Miller originally wanted to be a writer, and he was presented to Roger and said, I want to be a writer. And Roger said, we need actors. And Dick said, I'm an actor. And that's how it happened. People were used again and again. Jonathan Hayes being another one. And among the women, Allison Hayes, Beverly Garland. Although the interesting thing is that if anybody ended up dating Roger, as Beverly Garland did, and if they broke up, that was sort of the end of their Corman acting career. It's another matter.
Let me just turn, because when we talk about Corman, even though the films were low budget, as Beverly has mentioned, he had a good head for business. We can't leave the 1950s and B films without talking about Ed Wood and his sort of cycle of inanity, I guess. And Plan 9 Plan 9 from Outer Space is probably one of the most unintendedly funny films ever made. Blair, I would assume you address this a little bit in your book. Was he really that bad? Was he really that clueless about his utter lack of talent?
Well, the interesting thing about Ed Wood that I found is that he wasn't looked at as this colossal failure at the time. I mean, he struggled, certainly, but you look at reviews of his films, and reviewers didn't see them as being any worse than other stuff out there. They Plan 9 reviews they see as it's another one, and they would call them weirdies. Weirdies was the term. It's another weirdy film that, it's got this, George Johnson in it, and it's kind of silly, but it should play well with the kids and its target audience. It wasn't looked at the way that we look at it now, as the worst film ever made. It was looked at as just another in the long line of sci-fi B films that, should do pretty good. So, I mean, Ed Wood is a legend unto itself. He, in the 1950s, was still sort of in his prime. I think he was still kind of waiting for that film that would finally, get him his bigger break, let him sort of break through into, if not the studios, then something like AIP getting regular work.
One other I want to mention, one other person I want to mention is Tor Johnson, because he had the distinction of not only working on the Ed Wood's Plan 9, but on another film that's a B film and director that's considered atrocious, Coleman Francis, like The Beast of Yucca Flats. That wasn't AIP, I don't believe. That this was like another company, because there were. What was there any rivals to AIP? Who was their main B film rival in the '60s? Say late '50s.
I mean, Allied Artists was making sci-fi films in the late 1950s. That's what Monogram became. They some of their budgets were a little bit higher, of course, than AIP's. They were one of the major rivals, I would say, but they were sort of in a different economic tier, so to speak. There wasn't really any main competitor, I would say, to EIP, because what they did so well that there were copycats. Yeah. There were numerous copycats, but none of them really stayed in business all that long in the late 1950s, early 1960s.
Now, I had done a show about Vincent Price last year, and you can't talk about Corman without talking about his Poe series. Many, or if not all of them, had Vincent Price. Beverly, what was how did the Poe films of Corman come about, and what was Price's and Corman's relationship?
Okay, I'm in a good position to answer that, because when Vincent Price died, Roger asked me to write a tribute to him from his perspective. Roger was doing so well by AIP that they decided that instead of these really, really cheap movies, they would give him a little more money. I think somewhere in the $50,000. I'm not good at remembering numbers, but they were going to give him a lot more money. He was going to shoot in color, and he was going to have a star. And Roger immediately thought of the Poe stories that had captivated him as a kid, and the star who seemed right for that was Vincent Price, who certainly took up most of the budget for those bigger movies. I'd say somewhere in the $150,000 range was the budget. Don't quote me on that, please.
That was the average budget. Upwards of about $1 million for the first Poe. They slowly increased their budgets towards the end of the decade, but yeah, close to $1 million for the first Poe.
So, and Roger was a great admirer of Vincent Price, who was an elegant, sophisticated, well-read man, and Roger truly admired him for that. The one film in which he had not only Vincent Price, but also Boris Karloff and Peter Lorre, that was a wild one. That was, sorry, my mind is turning to mush. The Raven, where each of those men had a different style. That's something Roger pretty much emphasized to me, that Boris Karloff was very, very classically trained. Peter Lorre was bouncing off the walls, doing whatever he felt like at any given moment. And Vincent Price had to kind of hold the whole thing together, which he did with his usual Vincent Price aplomb. There was one Poe film made for a rival company where he was not able to use Vincent Price, and Ray Milland stepped in the Vincent Price role. But basically, Price was his star, and he loved having it.
Now, the '60s also saw Corman dub a lot of foreign films and re-release them. Probably the most famous one in my mind is when Planet of Storms, or Planeta Berg, which was a Russian space opera from Stanislav Lem's novel, and his film later, Solaris, was done by Andrei Tarkovsky. But that was first turned into Voyage to the Prehistoric Planet. which had a few scenes with the indomitable Faith Demergue interspersed in, and then also it became then Voyage to the Planet of Prehistoric Women with, I think it was it Jane Mansfield or no,
Maybe Van Doren.
maybe Van Doren, yeah, in it. So was that then a way to make quick money to get the rights to foreign film cheap, add in a few little studio cuts, 10, 15 minutes, and then just re-release it, Beverly?
Oh, it sure was, and it was something that continued throughout. Years and years later, I wound up working on a Corman film, which was made in Germany, and it starred not Peter Fonda, but Dennis.
Hopper.
Sorry,
Hopper.
Dennis Hopper, right, at his most unintelligible. I mean, I think he was deep into a lot of things at that point. And so suddenly we had this movie we had to somehow make sense out of, because it really was a lot of garbled footage that nobody could understand. And so it was a pattern always with him. But I should add that Roger had another involvement with foreign films that was very, very different, and that it shows you really the two sides of the man, which was that starting when I worked for him at New World Pictures, he was importing great classic foreign movies, including the first one was Ingmar Bergman's Cries and Whispers, which Roger treated with utmost dignity and respect and put out and did very, very nicely with, and then went on to do the films of Truffaut, Fellini's Amarcord, films by a lot of other great, there was Kurosawa, there were a lot of masterworks that saw a wider public in the United States because of Roger Corman. And I should just add to that I was involved with Fellini's Amarcord when that came out, and of course that was a masterpiece by a great Italian master. But Roger obviously wasn't going to change it, but he didn't like the lengths of the fades to black between the scenes. So that was something that he required an editor to do, was to cut those fades to black, and it was my job to keep nudging the editor about whether he had gone and done that yet. So he was not above making a few slight changes, even in the films of great European masters.
Now, Blair, we had talked earlier that foreign films were not around in the 40s in America, but I know in the 1960s, having stayed up many nights as a kid watching things like Chiller Theater or Creature Feature, that Britain especially, there were a lot of UFO and sci-fi films like Day of the Triffids and that kind of thing coming along, which were B films. Gorgo was another one, and there were a few other UFO films. And then obviously you get, I guess, the great rival to AIP, which were the Hammer horror films. How did Hammer come about and get into the U.S.? And were they sort of the equivalent of a Poverty Row studio that just came up, or when did that start? And
that started with in 1957, and it wasn't Poverty Row. They were actually distributed by the majors, and there were sort of bidding wars for some of these early Hammer hits with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. The Christopher Frankenstein, I think, was the first one that was imported, and it was handled as sort of a major release by, I want to say 20th Century Fox, I might be lying, but it was handled then by a major studio, not these Poverty Rows. So it sort of straddles the A-B divide at this time. There's a lot of blurring of boundaries that goes on by the late 1950s, and so by the time that becomes a big, huge success, they look at what else has been released by Hammer, and there are all sorts of companies, major studios, that are bidding and trying to get the rights to distribute all of these Hammer films. So they were more so at the level of the major studios as opposed to the impoverished stuff. If you want to look at the impoverished Poverty Row, you turn to a hack like Jerry Warren, who I pick on a lot in the Battle for the Bees, because he was not interested in artistry or even craftsmanship at all. He admitted in many interviews he was just in it to make as fast a buck as he could, and he would look at a lot of Mexican horror films and take them apart, reassemble two of them into a single American film, and then throw in a couple of scenes shot newly with John Carradine, like against a brick wall or a sheet or something, and then just slap it in to try and Americanize something that was, originally a Spanish or a Mexican film. So you want to look at the cheap stuff, you turn to a director like Jerry Warren in the 1960s, who I really hate.
Yeah. Beverly had mentioned Corman bringing in some foreign films, and in the 1960s, B films did sometimes take on issues, and I want to just talk about one film and then one filmmaker particularly, and then we'll break and then we'll talk from the 70s onward. The film that comes to mind as a social film, sort of like the old British kitchen sink films, was David and Lisa, which starred Keir Dullea, who later go on to 2001. And it's about these two socially awkward young people, and they meet in I think a sort of a mental hospital or something. And that brings up then Sam Fuller, who with Shock Corridor and some of his other early gangster films, Underworld USA. Just talk about a little bit about some of the more serious B films like that, and some of the serious filmmakers. Not that Corman wasn't serious, but in terms that Fuller never did out and out, the beast from, whatever.
Well, I mean, there are some great examples of very sort of subversive films coming out in the 1960s. Night of the Living Dead has been read as a comment on race relations in the 1960s. Shock Corridor is a great example of something that is sort of diving into the deeper, darker recesses of society, but no one's really paying attention to B films just so long as they're still profitable. I love the metaphor that Martin Scorsese has made. He says it's the director as smuggler working at the level of the Bs, in that when the budget is more relatively low, less producers are looking over your shoulder, you can smuggle in as much subversive stuff as you want, so far as you just keep it under the radar. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. Roger Corman made The Intruder, for example, which I don't know if it's as well remembered as Shock Corridor, for example, but there is the attempt at social commentary in a lot of these films in the 1960s, reflecting upon the changes that are going on in society. Yeah.
Well, let's end. Go ahead, Beverly.
Can I say something further about The Intruder?
Sure.
It's an important movie. Roger was trying really to take on the issue of desegregation and race relations, and he was very serious about it. Roger has always been a social, political liberal, and he really wanted to make a point with that movie. And at first it was going to have some studio backing, and someone like Tony Randall was going to play the lead, and then everybody backed away from the material because they felt it was too inflammatory, too gritty. Roger and his brother Gene made the movie. It took a lot of guts. They made it in southern Missouri using a lot of locals in the cast. Missouri isn't quite the South, but where they really had a kind of southern mentality. They had crowd scenes, they had a rabble-rouser, and they had apparently the FBI snooping around just finding out what was going on here. So they laid it on the line in terms of money, and they laid it on the line in terms really of personal safety. I should add that the star of that movie was someone who was to become rather better known, William Shatner, in perhaps one of his most interesting roles, I go out on a limb and say. But Roger said something very interesting at the time he made this movie. He was extremely proud of it, and he was interviewed and asked, are you going to continue to make gutsy social commentary pictures like this one? And he said, yes. And do you think you'll make money? And he said, well, it's not about making money. I really believe in this subject. As long as we break even, I'm going to go on continuing to make courageous movies of this sort. Well, he didn't break even, and Roger's next movie was The Premature Burial, and he went straight back into a much more friendly genre to him, the horror genre. He's always loved the idea of smuggling in social message, but The Intruder was really the one and only movie where he kind of put his heart on the sleeve and really made something that emotionally he deeply cared about.
Now, that was from a Charles Beaumont book, and Beaumont was well associated with The Twilight Zone and Rod Serling. I believe, wasn't that film originally supposed to have been an episode for The Twilight Zone, but they wouldn't allow it on TV, and that's how Corman might have gotten the rights to that? I've heard of that. I'm not sure if that's correct.
I don't know that, and there was someone doing some academic research on the project, and then that didn't come up, so I think perhaps that isn't the case. There was a long friendship with Beaumont, and years later, we actually made one of Beaumont's unfinished projects, which ended up as a film he had called Paranoia and ended up being called Brain Dead.
All right, well, let's end this segment here, and then in the next segment, I just want to talk about the 1970s through the current age, and we'll do that in a moment. I've been speaking with Beverly Gray and Blair Davis about B films, the history, and we're up to the 1970s. We were talking a little bit about social commentary towards the end of the first segment, and the 1970s certainly saw social commentary hit with Hollywood's, the new Hollywood of the 1970s, and that really, I think, trickled down into B films. Blaxploitation films came along at the time. Beverly, let me just start with you. Was Roger involved in any of the blaxploitation drama of that era?
Yeah, he sure was. Roger was always a great one for jumping on bandwagons. He saw what was happening. He had people like Pam Grier. He wanted to make films of that sort, and that was my era at New World Pictures, so I remember it well. He was even trying to turn things into blaxploitation movies. We had something called The Final Come Down, which wasn't making money, and they decided to sell it, to retitle it, which was a great Corman technique. And they were going to retitle it The Return of the Symbionese Liberation Army, and basically take the same movie, change a little bit, change the title, change the ad campaign, put it out there again. Well, that hit the trades, and everybody started calling up the office wanting to audition for this new film, The Return of the Symbionese Liberation Army, at which point, since the movie was already made and we didn't want any actors calling us up, we announced that we were only taking card-carrying members of the organization. But Roger, even when Martin Scorsese, who of course got his start with Roger as a director, came to him and said, I want to make this passion project of mine called Mean Streets. And Roger said, well, my brother Gene did very well with a blaxploitation film. If you can, and he apparently uses these words according to Scorsese, if you can swing a little and make your characters black, then I will give you the money to shoot in New York City. Well, Scorsese didn't want to take Mean Streets, which is, of course, about kids of Italian descent on the streets of New York. He didn't want to change it into a blaxploitation film, so he went elsewhere for his financing. And Mean Streets was actually shot in L.A. Trivia time.
Well, Blair, let me turn to you because the 1970s really saw the rise of what people or critics at the time would call sort of gratuitous violence too. You had mentioned Night of the Living Dead, and I know going back early in the 60s, two films that come to mind as precursors to Night of the Living Dead were Carnival of Souls, which was a one-off film by Herc Harvey, which was a really terrific film, psychological and whatnot. And then also Vincent Price in The Last Man on Earth, which was an adaptation of Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. Then we get Night of the Living Dead, and that seemed to be, with the scenes of cannibalism, with the zombies, to sort of blow the lid off of anything goes. You had films like Last House on the Left by Wes Craven, a lot of these other sort of cheapy knockoff films. And by the end of the 70s, you got Halloween and the slasher genre rise. What do you think was sort of in the mix in the 1970s that saw a lot of this blood and guts from a level that we hadn't seen before?
Well, I mean, certainly stems again industry-wise in 1968 once the rating system changes. The MPAA, Motion Picture. I always forget what is Administration Association or something. The rating system changes, whereby now you are allowed to show stuff that you couldn't in the 1960s. You can be less subtle in how you depict your gore, and you can have the gratuitousness that before in the 1960s there was some though before. There was Herschel Gordon Lewis, for example, with Blood Feast and 2000 Maniacs, who made films that were for the drive-in circuit. So there are again these precursors to that gore of the 1970s, but you can have films like The Wild Bunch in 1969 where people get ripped apart by machine guns. It's a change in what society permits to be shown on screen at both the level of the A film and the B film. So, The Exorcist, for example, is to some people's minds far gorier than any B film that is out there. Yeah. It's not, but they think it is.
Now, how about Roger, Beverly? Did he sort of get on this sort of splatter, fest kind of films? Because I know, like George Romero did a biker film, and then he did Monkey Shines, which were kind of psychologically violent. Where was the Corman ethos going in films in the 70s into the 80s with the slasher film market?
Before I answer that, I just want to add one thing that,
Sure,
at least to me, is very much a part of the splatter genre. The great thing about horror movies, as many people have pointed out, is that they really reflect whatever the tensions are in society at that particular time, whether it's an anxiety over a nuclear attack or whatever it is. But what was really happening and what was really bringing blood, opening the floodgates, as someone said, into the movies, which I always date from 1967 and Bonnie and Clyde, is Vietnam. Vietnam War was not only happening, but it was coming into our living rooms via television. And a lot of what was reflected in those movies were, in some cases, former soldiers coming back and bringing memories of what they had observed, or people's fears of what seemed to be going on over there. Certainly the George Romero films reflect that. And Roger, always quick to see whatever was happening, was grabbing on to the same kinds of grotesqueness.
Now, Blair, let me ask what the 1980s brought, because to me, that's the rise of the VHS and the sort of straight-to-video kind of film. So you would get B films, really. Were they sort of just being crowded out of actually playing in theaters at this time? Or was this an economic opportunity that low-budget filmmakers were just seizing because people who wanted to stay at home, it would take 6 months to a year after a film was released to get released on a VHS tape. Were they just cranking out these straight-to-video films to capitalize on a new market?
It sort of worked both ways. Yes, there were a lot of companies that saw the rise of VHS as this new platform for distribution. That now I can put it on the shelf, and you get nice enough box art. It looks as appealing as any A film would. The same way that now with Redbox and Netflix, your tiny little postage stamp poster looks great, and you'll click on that, and you'll pick that up off the shelf at the video store in the 80s. But at the same time, Hollywood was actively looking at low-budget product that they could pump out into theaters as well. They've got the rise of the American Ninja films, which are pretty much just B films. You've got a lot of military-type Rambo knockoffs. It was with any given genre cycle that emerged in the 1980s, Hollywood would look at, well, what else is out there that we can throw into the theaters to take advantage of this trend? I mean, the teen films like Porky's and Meatballs, there were a lot of knockoffs that you look at what's out there to distribute, and you pick it up and then you pump it out. That's how the Friday the 13th films came about after the success of Halloween. I was Paramount looking around at well, we got to cash in on this slasher trend. First Friday the 13th was made for what I think $500,000 maybe, and picked it up, distributed it, and so begins the legend. So it was both directions in terms of theatrical releases and home video.
Now, I know go ahead, Beverly. You want to say something?
Okay, yes. Roger was very, very canny about the rise of video. In fact, a fellow named Brad Prevoy met Roger at a Stanford football game, and Brad was an attorney by his own description, not the world's greatest attorney, but he had a great idea for movies that video was where it was going, and he wanted to capitalize on that. And by the end of the weekend, Brad had come aboard as Roger's finance and sales guy. And by the time I returned to Roger at Concord New Horizons, we were cranking out movies at an astonishing rate because the majors weren't quite ready to do it yet, but we were. So we were a small company. We had, the creative staff was maybe 20, 30 people, and we were making between 20 and 40 movies a year and just cranking them out, giving them great box art, sometimes creating the box art before we'd made the movie. We knew how to sell, and we knew how to get those things into the stores and flying off the shelves of the stores. It didn't matter that sometimes we were making the same movie over and over and over again, whether a martial arts movie or I hope we go into the Slumber Party Massacre movies. That was a hot genre for us for a while, or dinosaur movies. We knew how to sell it.
Yeah. Carnosaur was probably the most, I guess, famous of the Corman dinosaur films. But I remember the 80s also, you had such really ridiculous knockoffs. I remember there was a Klaus Kinski film called Creature, which was such a ripoff of Alien in the early 80s or whatnot. But you can't talk about 80s B films, though, without talking about Bruce Campbell and his cycle of films, which were basically sort of more spoofs, basically, of the Romero-type films. Bruce Campbell has spent the better part of his life, as a B film star, and he's probably the most recognizable B film star of the last 30 years. If you could just, Blair, maybe talk a little bit about his persona and because his films were sort of meta, and so you had B films almost being sort of meta about B films.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, he has the connection with Sam Raimi, growing up with Sam and making the Evil Dead films. So you've got this major sort of auteurist talent in Sam Raimi who has a sharp eye for how to create a horror film that is very, very visually stylish, and then sort of using Bruce Campbell's sort of wink-wink, nudge-nudge acting techniques at times to make something that is not only great to look at, but also fun to watch. And so I love Bruce Campbell's films, and he kind of is playing the role of a B actor in his films themselves, and has made movies like I think it's called The Man Called Bruce, and movies in which Bubba Hotep and the like, in which he is almost sort of self-aware at times of his own fandom, and that's sort of built into the films. You get into what we call in academia the postmodern era of self-referentiality, but that's the academic in me. I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah. Now, Beverly, with Corman, sort of towards the end of the century, beginning of this century, he was doing a lot of films like, I'm just looking here, I know that he had several Carnosaur movies, he had remakes of Corman films, and then he sort of got into these things like Sharktopus and Dino Croc and whatnot, which I guess was his attempt. I don't know. He didn't make Sharknado, which is, but that was his sort of attempt to get on the bandwagon again. Those sorts of things.
And it kind of, those were made, those monster mashup movies like Piranhaconda and things like that. They bother me a little because Roger, in his way, always took his subject matter seriously, however goofy it may have been. He approached his film seriously, and I think he's gotten a bit beyond that as he's been discovered by the Sci-Fi Channel, and has made things that were just flat out silly. But he's gotten older. I think everyone knows he's still out there making films, and maybe having some fun with it. But the Corman alumni have always been bothered by the fact that here's a man with a lot of talent and heaps of money who will continue to make the schlock movies and not do what he might once have done, possibly is make a really good movie.
Is that part of his psyche from growing up, Beverly?
Pardon me?
Was that part of his psyche from growing up, like growing up during the Great Depression, that he just doesn't want to spend?
Roger is a man who cannot spend money. I've always thought of him, I had to read Silas Marner in high school, and about the miser who hoards money and just doesn't use it for anything, just piles it up and looks at it, and that's always the way I thought of Roger. He prides himself on walking around with socks with holes in them and wearing the same sweater for a decade. It's just beyond him to lay out money when it's something that he's quite capable of doing. And I would like to have seen Roger at his best. But the movies have gotten cheaper and cheaper and more redundant over the years.
It's interesting, Beverly, because I read a year or two ago that he's involved in some lawsuit with some guy who tried to sort of like a Bernie Madoff kind of scheme. So I guess Roger tried to invest his money in some kind of a scheme, and it backfired on him, and now he's involved in some big lawsuit. Could you just talk momentarily about that, if you know anything about that?
I know just a little about it. Yes, it is true, and he's really gone public with that in the last few years. But he was always trying to make money in other ways. At one time, there was an organic farm, and there was various other things. So he always kind of liked the idea of multiplying his money. But movies are the one thing that he really knows, and the one way he really knows to make money, which is one reason I don't think he's ever stopped. I mean, he just turned 90. And he's still running a smaller and smaller company, but he is continuing to churn out movies. And I think you will find that some of them are the same movies he's made over and over and over again. To give you an example, there was a period when I worked for him at Concord New Horizons where the martial arts genre was hot, kickboxing was hot. It was the era of Van Damme and people of that nature.
Yeah.
So Roger wanted to have his own martial arts star, and very shrewdly he went to a real martial arts star, Don the Dragon Wilson, who he called up out of the blue and said, I want you to star in some movies for me. So that was Blood Fist. It took me years to realize that our Blood Fist, which was written by Robert King, who went on to have a lot of TV success with The Good Wife, but this was his first produced movie, was Blood Fist. He just cranked it out, pretty much stole the plot from the movie, I think the movie Kickboxer. And it was about the young man whose brother has died, and he's got to go into the tournament and find out who killed his brother, and he's got this wily Chinese mentor who, I'm sorry to ruin the suspense, turns out to be the killer, and then they go mano a mano, the big finish. That movie did really well, and we made a number of additional Blood Fist movies with Don the Dragon Wilson. And then one day at the studio, when it was around Christmas time and nothing was happening, and Roger couldn't stand having people on salary and not doing anything, so he said, we're going to make Blood Fist again, but instead of setting it in Manila, where the first film was made, we're going to set it in LA, and it's going to be the down and dirty under the freeway tournament. And instead of the wily Chinese mentor, it's going to be the black street bum. But basically, the same story. So I have a writing credit on that. It's called Full Contact. And that did well. And about 6 months later, all of a sudden, we were setting that same movie, same plot, in outer space, and calling it Dragonfire. And then that was spring. And in fall, we made the female version with Katya Sassoon as the lead in Angel Fist.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about doing a sword and sorcery version. So Roger was continuously making the same movie without shame, and I think with a certain amount of pride in terms of how he was really, I don't want to say ripping off the public because they're all enjoyable movies, but certainly they're not the height of anyone's creative potential.
Yeah. Blair, let me turn to you, and I want to end this segment just talking about the last 20 or so years, because when we think of B films in this century, I know my wife looks back, I think in the late 80s, there was a film called Troll 2, and in the last decade or so, there's a film called The Room that has become a B film schlock classic. Is there anyone that you know of, Blair, that is sort of the Corman of the 21st century, or are they just these one-offs? Because it reminds me sort of like the music industry. You used to have the big record labels, and you'd have album-oriented rock, and now with the fracturing and the internet, you get just singles have come back again with people on YouTube. And it seems to me that the B film industry is more just sort of one-shot directors here or there doing little things. There doesn't seem to be a Corman. I'm not an expert. Is there sort of a young Corman of the 21st century out there?
It's a tough question. It's a great question. I see more so that in the last 20, even 30 years, Hollywood has been recruiting potential superstar B directors very, very quickly. They've been, you look at who directed the latest blockbusters like Jurassic World and some of these ones. They make these smaller films for like $1 or $2 million, and then they get scooped up by the industry and given a shot at making a huge blockbuster. So Hollywood, whether it's a good trend or not, has been looking very closely at independent filmmakers and recruiting them very, very fast. So whether or not they could have gone on to make a sustained number of B films, who knows? The bigger trend I see is these kind of shark, octopus, whatever movies, and Asylum Pictures is a company that is sort of the kingpins of this. They make the Sharknado films, and so that's where you've got this kind of top-down, it's not quite corporate, but it's a company that has a template that you make a certain type of film, you make it very, very quickly, and you can distribute it to your red boxes and your Netflixes and the like. You'll know you'll make a certain small amount of profit, and they're not that creative, but they have fun, schlocky titles. So that, I think, has been, it's in the midst of its heyday. I think the decline will come relatively soon, but they've taken advantage of the shift, the demise of the video stores, whereby you've got this new access of distribution to your red boxes, and when you click on new releases, your Sharknado 2 will come up next to your Avengers 2, because they both came out the same day, and you both have the same little tiny picture next to them. Just as when you scroll through your Netflix selection, each one is given its own little box, whereby you used to go to the video store, you know what the big films are because there were 30 copies on the shelf, as opposed to the one copy of the B movie.
Yeah.
The whole platform has changed now, so Asylum's taking advantage of that to great success. So that's the big shift that I've seen.
Okay, well, let's end this segment. In the final segment, I'll give both you and Beverly a chance to give your final thoughts on Roger Corman and B films in general, and we'll do that when we return. I have been speaking with Blair Davis and Beverly Gray about B films and Roger Corman, and here I just want to wrap up some final thoughts. If you could, Beverly, talk a little bit about your final thoughts on Corman, his influence and legacy in B films, but also film world in general.
Well, Roger received an honorary Oscar in the year 2009, and there were a lot of very important pillars of the Hollywood community were thrilled by that, because above all, Roger is known as someone who started people on their way. He was the ultimate training ground and proving ground for just a staggering list. First of all, I'll mention the famous directors: Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Jonathan Demme. Ron Howard directed his first film for Roger Corman. And as Roger said to him then, in a classic line, "Ron, if you do a good job for me on this movie, you'll never have to work for me again." And of course, so it came to pass. So Ron Howard is a director. But He would take a chance on unknowns, like James Cameron, who started off in Battle Beyond the Stars as someone who invented a front projection kind of device that didn't work very well, suddenly became the art director of that film and just through talent and ambition moved forward. A lot of the people who moved forward, as you'll notice, are people who went from a Roger Corman budget to a massive budget. When Francis Ford Coppola made his Dracula, he said, "I'm making this in the Roger Corman style," and I found that extremely amusing because, yeah, it kind of looked Corman-esque, but it was made for $40 million. Roger Corman has never made a movie for $40 million. But the list of people goes on, and I should also mention just the masses of people within Hollywood, in all phases of Hollywood, everyone from agents to cinematographers. The cinematographer, I'm blanking again, who shot Schindler's List and won an Oscar. He got his start. His first movies were shot for Roger Corman, Janusz Kaminski.
And John Sayles, too.
Pardon me?
John Sayles, too, the sort of the godfather of modern American indie film.
And one thing interesting about John Sayles, at least someone I spoke to for my Corman book, and was very, very enlightening. John Sayles was a somewhat successful short story writer who wanted to get into movies, obviously through Corman did as a screenwriter, but just sort of soaked up the how-tos of movie making, and then went on to make his first film, Return of the Secaucus 7, knowing the Roger Corman lessons, which is what can I do cheaply, what can I do well, and take it from there. So he knew he had access to a lot of actors and a house, and that's how he chose to make the particular movie he did about a class reunion, and went on in his own very much independent way, very, very proud of the Corman lessons he'd learned, but by no means sticking to the Corman style. So the list of people who've inherited something from Roger is very, very long, and that's the first thing to applaud him for. And Quentin Tarantino took Corman aesthetics and blew them up in terms of much bigger budget, much bigger ambitions. But there's a lot of Corman at work in the whole bigger B-movie genre, the films, the Alien, and the films like that. Those have soaked up the lessons of Corman and put, when Jaws came out, someone said, "What is Jaws but a Roger Corman movie on a big budget?" Yeah. So I'll leave it there, but he's been a tremendous gift to all of us who love movies or who make movies.
Well, thank you, Beverly. Blair, let me just ask you to wrap up your thoughts on the influence and legacy of B's, starting back from the serials and the Poverty Row films of the 30s onward. And do you think, after you speak of the legacy, do you think that B Film's future, if there is one, is going to be, say, on YouTube or those kinds of servers?
Well, the way that I sort of trace the narrative in Battle for the Bees is the ways in which directors like Roger Corman and independent filmmakers working in the 1950s sort of shaped the future then and the present now of how Hollywood interacts with independent filmmakers and the way in which they can look at low-budget filmmaking as something that they can incorporate into distribution or into looking at talent to make films for themselves. And in the past, there was this sharp divide. It was this A-B divide. Those are those types of films, and these are the good films over here. These are the prestige films, and never the two shall meet unless, you prove yourself on one level, then you graduate to the next. Now there's the chance that, you can get your talents like Robert Rodriguez and Spike Lee and even Tarantino, as you mentioned, that can make a single film and then go on to a long and prosperous career making art that the masses actually get to see, that you don't have to seek out an out of the way drive-in or grindhouse theater, where yes, there may be something that's been smuggled in, but it's sold as just this cheap novelty schlock. So the legacy of the Bees I see as being this sort of new respect for independent filmmaking that has persisted into the modern era to a certain extent. As for the future of B films, we've seen this shift with the death of the video store as opening up all of these new digital platforms for distribution that have aided companies like Asylum Films and all of their various competitors, and certainly the rise of the 500 cable channels and the need for product as well. That has opened up a massive floodgate for low budget product to come in. I think the YouTube thing is particularly interesting in that again, you've got this new opportunity for independent filmmakers to get their stuff seen by the masses. So that, I think, is something to look at. Much as the music industry with your Justin Biebers has seen YouTube and independent voices enter the mainstream. Francis Ford Coppola has always said that the next major filmmaker will be this teenage girl with a tiny little digital camera or her cell phone, and I still think that remains true today.
Well, I want to thank both of you for your time. Blair Davis, I'll link to his webpage, and his book is The Battle for the Bees, 1950s Hollywood and the Rebirth of Low-Budget Cinema. And BeverlyGray.com is Beverly's website, and her book on Roger Corman is called Roger Corman, Blood-Sucking Vampires, Flesh-Eating Cockroaches, and Driller Killers. So I want to thank you both for your time and your expertise.
Thank you. Can I mention I have a blog called Beverly in Movieland.
Okay, sure.
Which is about movies, movie making, and growing up Hollywood adjacent. And I have a great deal of fun writing it, and I hope to have some more conversations on the web.
All right. Well, thank you both.
Thank you.